25 of the Paradise is quite confusing at first because it seems that although Dante is in paradise, in these high heavens, having just been blessed by Peter, crowned by Peter, for showing that he has this fullness of faith that's capable of receiving divine sight. It seems here in Canto 25 that he makes mistakes, he kind of gets told off. You wonder quite what's going on. I think what it's driving at, what Dante the poet is enabling us to adjust to, is what you might call right hope. The subject of this canto is hope, the previous canto having talked about faith. So the second of these virtues which Dante must show, demonstrate the brilliance of within him in order that he can share in the way that they brilliantly light up the whole of creation. And so by encouraging us to see more deeply into what this canto on hope is really talking about, Dante the poet is fostering what you might call a right hope in us, because Dante's seeming mistakes are actually seen as not mistakes when you align to this correct kind of hope. It opens with him saying how maybe one day the wolves that are consuming Florence might change their mind and welcome him back to his baptismal home, to the place that he longed to return to all his life and yet never did. And they might do so were they to recognise his sacred poem that brings together heaven and earth, and for which he himself has laboured so long. And if they were to do that, if they were to welcome him back to Florence, then wouldn't they crown him with the poet's laurel, which would be an earthly correspondent of the heavenly laurel that Peter has just crowned him with? It's an immensely powerful image, and it's working on a number of levels. At one level is the earthly level, Dante, the mortal's hope that even against hope he might return to Florence. But it's also working at a high level because he's saying that he now knows that his poem has brought heaven and earth together. It's breathed in by divine breath as much as it's been worked over by his mortal pen. He's had to put in the long work, but it's become a receptacle for the divine words, the divine breath, the divine light. He is showing that his poem has become a true expression of the contemplative life. If you like, it is a womb within which the divine light can be conceived and give birth as well. These metaphors that he's been using in the last two or three cantos. So Dante is seeing at this higher level too. And I think that that's what this opening set of tercets and the canto is really about, fostering that right hope in us, which can see from the anagogic level. Remember these different levels of interpretation that the poet is fostering in us, from the literal, everyday human hopes, you might say, in this case, through the allegorical, beginning to see that there's more, the tropological level where actually your sight changes as Dante's has been changing through his long labour. And now he is able to see at the anagogic, at the divine level, as it were, from the top down, as well as from the bottom up. And I think that is signalled in these opening few verses too, because Dante talks about how if he were to return to Florence, he would be speaking with a different voice and wearing a new fleece. He'd likened himself to a lamb, and he's saying that he would be wearing a new fleece and speaking with a different voice were he to return to Florence. And that reference to the fleece signals a sort of running set of metaphors that are going to be out throughout this canto, which is about putting on the new garment. and it's the Christian image of the new garment that the bride wears when she joins with the bridegroom, and references to brides and to the wedding feast are going to be made throughout the canto as well. And that is the anagogic hope. It's the tremendous hope, as put in the Christian tradition, that we human beings are being given the fleece, the gown, being made ready to become brides of Christ, the bridegroom, that we will be joined with the divine as a bride and groom are joined. That is the fullness, astonishing fullness of true hope that Dante, I think, now sees and will be celebrated in this canto. But he remembers his older hopes as well, like the hope of returning to Florence, and sees how they're transcended, but invites us to consider our more earthly, literal hopes and how they might be transcended as well in this vision of our final destination, our being joined with the divine once more. So Dante, the poet, sets that up for us at the beginning of the canto. But it also means that Dante, the pilgrim, is now full of the right hope. And sure enough, as is the way in Paradise, when you're ready to see something, you do see something. He sees the great apostle of hope coming towards him. He descends out of the light from whence Peter had come as well. And this is the apostle James. The word James, the name James, is the word name associated with hope in the New Testament. In fact, there's several Jameses in the New Testament, in particular the so-called James the Great, who was one of the three inner apostles that saw Jesus' transfiguration, saw the rising of Jairus, his daughter, and saw Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and be ministered to by the angels, these most intimate moments of Jesus' life that gave them the sense of right hope, the hope that Jesus reached for but also showed in his earthly life. But it also refers to James the Less, James the Little, who was the author of the Epistle of James, and is used to kind of gather up other references to James in the New Testament. And James, the author of the epistle, also speaks of hope directly, and so the two Jameses are intermingled here in this canto, because in their different ways they are associated with this great virtue and theme of hope. And Dante, the pilgrim, now sees this great light of hope coming towards him. The light comes down, it sides by Peter, and the description is given of two doves, two lovebirds, greeting each other with coos and with joy. It's one of the first of the explicitly marital images in the canto. These two apostles greet each other as a kind of bride and groom, and since being joined with the divine is the very heart of their hope and their experience now. And so that just kind of showers down in their greeting to each other now. And Dante also then says that having greeted each other in this joyful way, they stood before him, coram me, he says, using a moment of Latin in the poem. And that takes us back to the moment where Francis was said to have married Lady Poverty, because this word coram is used there as well. And so again, it brings up another image of marriage. Francis trusting, knowing the fullness of hope in the divine expressed in his marriage to Lady Poverty, not hoping in earthly things, you might say. So this imagery of marriage and what you hope in correctly is starting to be built up here. Beatrice speaks next and invites James, the light of hope, to make all of heaven now resound with this great virtue in a celebration of it. She's going to ask him to ask Dante about hope in order that the heavens may sing by Dante's words. And it's very striking how A number of times, James is referred to as the second flame. In fact, 3 times Dante the poet refers to James as the second flame. He is, of course, literally the second flame. But I think this is also intimating at this marriage metaphor too, because, of course, marriage is about two becoming one. But also in that two-ness becoming one, a third is born, which is their love that their marriage makes all the more. And love is, of course, going to come next. So this is already beginning to hint how hope and love are deeply connected. And of course, hope, as in right hope, is only possible because Dante also already has expressed right faith. He knows what to have faith in, the promise of divine life. That becomes his hope, and then that hope brings to life love. That is the third, which this canto almost can't contain, as is the way with Trinitarian life, the way that it flows over. And yet it does, I think, partly to enable us to see more deeply into this relationship between faith, hope, and love, in slightly esoteric ways, using numbers, in illustrative ways, using this image particularly of the bride and the bridegroom and the garment and the marriage. Dante, the poet, is inviting us to be alongside Dante almost in this canto as we adjust our hopes and raise them to the anagogic level. James replies to Beatrice and celebrates hope. What else can that light do? By telling Dante that this is the sphere that all mortal souls must rise to and drink from in order to become radiant with hope. And that gives Dante hope. And in fact, now he's able to lift his eyes back up to the lights that had descended. He'd lowered them out of brightness. And very strikingly, he's able to look at the light head on. He has hope. He knows what this virtue is, and so is able to share in its light. It doesn't blind him. And James then turns to Dante directly and says, celebrate this hope. You clearly are here because our emperor, God, as James puts it, has invited you to these high courts, and James adds, will invite you to the highest court, to the Imperium, even though you haven't yet died. That is another expression of this right hope to join God in the highest of the high heavens. And James says, since that's so, tell us about this hope. What is it? How much of it do you have? And where does it come from? And the second question is answered first. Again, I think a sort of play on this second element, which is going to join up in the three to make the three, because Beatrice comes in at this point and says, I will answer for Dante on the second point, how much hope he has within him. And you wonder why. Can't Dante do it for himself? But I think what this is about is actually a rather beautiful and subtle development of what had happened to Dante when he'd first met Beatrice in the earthly Eden at the top of Mount Purgatory. Because if you remember, that's when Beatrice had very strongly, over several cantos, chastised Dante at heart for having the wrong hope. When he'd first met Beatrice in earthly life, this wonderful love had been instilled in him, and yet for much of his mortal life he'd placed his trust, placed his hope in other lovers even, we'd wondered. And Beatrice had chastised him for that. And in particular, when the angels in the Garden of Eden at the top of Mount Purgatory had seen how distressed Dante looked at this chastising in the moment that finally again he'd seemingly been reunited with Beatrice, the angels started to sing one of the Psalms of hope. They sang, in you, O Lord, do we put our trust, do we put our hope? And Beatrice had silenced the angels at that point. She said, no, This is the moment for him to be in that tropological space of adjustment in order that he can see the right hope. And so she silenced them for attempting a kind of spiritual bypass. He had to be changed. He had to go through that difficult moment in order now to be full of the right hope. And so Beatrice is able to answer for him. She doesn't cut things off. She actually speaks now. And I think that that is a wonderful healing moment for Dante the Pilgrim when Beatrice speaks for him and celebrates what she now sees of his right hope, because she tells James, look, you who can see into the mind of God can also see into the heart of Dante now, and this way that divine telepathy operates, and see that his heart overflows with hope. He now knows what right hope is, his poem, his life, that he's here. It actually spoke all along of this right hope, even when at times he got distracted by the lesser hopes. And so there's a wonderful, joyful moment as Beatrice speaks. Dante then leaps straight back in, as you might expect him to, by answering the first and the third question. Again, this nice little play on numbers. He says what hope is, and he also describes how his hope was born within him. Answering the first question first, he uses a sentence from Peter Lombard, one of the great medieval theologians, not just speaking the formula, but speaking it from his heart, which of course is what can be felt here in the high heavens, much as Peter had realized and known and seen that Dante was speaking of faith because he knew it through and through. And he says that hope is the expectation of future bliss, which is given both by God's grace and, interestingly, by human merit. Now, this is a really fascinating little addition. You might expect that true hope is given by God's grace, and it's the hope for divine union with the right garments in the marriage feast. That much would be expected, perhaps. But this addition of human merit is important as well. And I think that what that signifies is that Dante and the true hoper needs to have hope in the right things. That is what their work on earth enables them to become aligned to adjust to. Their hope does misfire, as indeed Dante's had. But by working through that, even as Dante had worked so hard at his poetry and his poem in order to be able to write these things down now, that is the work which we're invited to do in order that our hope can find the right object. And of course, James, in his epistle, had written about the link between faith and work. And I think that that is what is being intimated to here. It's not that our work itself secures salvation, secures this union. What our work does is work in tandem with the divine grace that's given in order that we can fully, self-aware, consciously, with our desire, our will, all these things fully operative, fully intact, fully ourselves, join in with that divine grace to reach the end of true hope. Dante then also answers the third question and says that many stars instilled this hope within him, but the writer of the Psalms, David, instilled it in him first. And he then likens the sacred poems of the Psalms to his own sacred poem. He's saying that the comedy, he realizes now, is akin to the Psalms in its capacity to issue hope into the world. It is a comedy. It might sound like a boast, but it's not. It's a moment of clarity which Dante has in these high heavens, just to state it as he is. And then Dante adds that James's own letters had given him the dew of hope, watered his life as well with that same hope, and that water that overflows from his pen is part of the same hope. He is showing that he's a co-worker with James, which in a way, again, is quite remarkable. Is this a boast? But no, I think it's just a statement. He's here in this heaven with James, enjoying the same brilliance, the same light. So he's just celebrating what is true. He understands this hope. And it gives James great pleasure. James the Great was called one of the sons of thunder in the Gospels, and James's light here, the light of hope here in the high heavens, now issues flashes of lightning and thunder in celebration for what Dante has said, joining in with the same spirit. And so indeed the heavens do sing with hope. But James doesn't stop there. He asks Dante a further question and says, what was the promise which this hope that you see instilled within you? Now he asks this question to share in the joy of hope so that Dante can give voice again to this hope. It's not a moment of testing, and Dante gives a wonderful answer. He says that this hope's promise was found both in the Old and the New Testaments, which is to say, when you look, you can actually see it throughout the whole of your life, throughout the whole of creation, throughout the whole of salvation history. And it's the hope which Isaiah spoke of when he talked of the wedding garments being given to the bride. And then also it's the hope that John spoke of in the Revelation of John, the John who is the third about to appear in the next canto, this pressing in of what John stands for, even so. But the moment now that Dante remembers is when John 2 in the book of Revelation talked about the new white raiments that the saints will be given. And in a way, I think this is the kind of culmination of the reflections on hope, given to us directly, whereas previously they've been nodded and nudged and given to us almost in a kind of code to see through in order that our sight might be raised to this right hope. Because these are the explicit metaphors of the marriage feast of the bride and the bridegroom. And so Dante is able to say them now, and it causes great joy indeed to resound around heaven with a sound that's particularly meaningful and lovely for Dante because he hears a psalm of hope being sung. It's able to be sung fully and joyfully now. Beatrice isn't silencing these angels anymore. And so I think you can go so far as to say that Dante and Beatrice now are joined. They're singing from the same hymn sheet. She can answer for him, he can answer for himself. Their love, their commingling, their coming together is now shaped by the right hope that Dante sees as Beatrice has seen all along through the Paradise. It's again just worth stressing how high this right hope is, how daring, how wonderful right hope is. And maybe that's another message from this canto, is that often our lesser hopes is because we don't hope enough, as much as because we hope for the wrong things. We are invited to share in the divine life as a bride and groom are invited to share in their life with each other. It's really quite extraordinary. And because this coming together always makes for a third, overflows in new love and life, another star now shines brightly from the source that Peter and James had come from. This is going to be John appearing, the third. And it's said that he shines so brightly that if the crab constellation, if one of the stars from the constellation of the crab had shone this brightly, then winter on Earth would seem like a single day. It's a slightly elaborate way that Dante has of putting it, but the crab was the constellation that dominates the night sky during the winter month, and particularly during the longest nights and the shortest days. And so this is saying that the light that now is springing forth would dispel all darkness. That is in effect the metaphor that Dante is invoking here. And it's appropriate because this light, John, is the light of love, which does indeed dispel all darkness. Dante describes it rushing towards James and Peter as a bride rushes out on her wedding day, full of joy, full of delight in the day itself and in herself, in fact. It's another allusion to brides and marriage feasts. This third light joins James and Peter, and Beatrice is said to stand alongside them, herself looking like a bride. She is contemplating their joy, sharing in their joy as they dance and sing around each other now as a three. The sense of completeness faith has given born to hope, which has given birth to love. The one has become two and now has become three. And they are, of course, sharing in the divine life. So why wouldn't they be celebrating in this Trinitarian way? But then the canto becomes slightly more mysterious again, and it's signalled in the way that Beatrice names John. She describes him as the one who lay at Jesus' breast at the Last Supper, and the one who looked after Jesus' mother, as Jesus had requested from the cross. So the figure of Christ is being put centre stage here. He who was both fully God and fully human. And it seems that it causes Dante to stare at the new light with a particular question on his mind. It said that he stares into the brightness, and in fact it blinds him. He can't tolerate it. He's not looking at it in the right way, in fact, as he'd managed to look at James in the right way and so could tolerate the light. And I think what's going on here is that Dante has this question of how the divine and the human are joined. You know, why wouldn't he? In a way, that is the heart of the mystery, that this imagery of the bride and the marriage feast and the garment, the glorious body that we will put on when we enter the heavens. That's been the whole theme of this canto. And now with John before him, it becomes even more pressing how this might come about, because there was a story in the medieval world, which Dante the poet describes for us here in the poem now, that John had ascended bodily into the heavens when he died. You know, much as Jesus has ascended, much as Mary had ascended, much as Elijah was said to have ascended. It was known to happen on occasion. And Dante is wondering whether this is true of John, whether he can see into John's presence now to try and get some sense of how that could have come about, as a foretaste of how the mortal and the divine really are joined together. If he can see that, he can not just have right hope, but he can have direct knowledge of how this tremendous thing really comes about. Now, John spots that Dante is going blind. He is not looking at his light in the right way. And he says to Dante, look, my body is on earth, my mortal body is on earth where it died. I wasn't bodily ascended into heavens. As it were, don't look for what can't be found in me. And he tells Dante to write to his fellows back on earth that John wasn't bodily ascended into heaven. He says Jesus and Mary were, I wasn't. But what's also strange, and if not held within the right hope, also is potentially troubling, is that Dante really has gone blind. And the canto ends with Dante saying, here I was in the high heaven, having been, as it were, celebrated and celebrating right faith and right hope, and yet I was now blind, not able to see around paradise, not even able to see Beatrice next to him. Even more possibly troubling, Dante describes how the music stopped, the dancing ceased, the triune breath stopped blowing around them. And Dante says it was a bit like the moment when people are rowing, a team of oarsmen is rowing, and suddenly the whistle goes, they lift their blades out of the water, maybe to prevent them from rowing into danger, Or just to give them a moment of rest from fatigue, Dante the poet adds, making us wonder, is he in danger, or is he just a bit exhausted by this celebration of hope? And we don't know at the end of Canto 25. It leaves us in suspense. We suspect it must be a good suspense that's just going to be a moment where we step over into a new horizon as right love is discussed. But it is a tense moment. We're not quite sure. I think inviting us to pause as well, even as there's now a moment of silence in heaven, to consider whether we are seeing these things aright, whether we're following Dante closely behind his boat, as he had told us very clearly at the beginning of the Paradise we must do.